you done now? Oh, Brad, what have you done now?
Doc! Okay, relax, Doc. It's me. It's Martin.
No, it can't be. Just sent you back to the future.
Yeah. Oh, I know you did send me back to the future, but I'm back. I'm back from the future.
Great Scott.
Wait a minute, Doc. Are you telling me that you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
The way I see it, if you're gonna build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?
Whoa, this is heavy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast, the only podcast looking back in time with the greatest film trilogy of all time, Back to the Future. I'm your friend in time, Brad Gilmore, and we are back with another episode here in Season 7 of the show. Excited to get to this one today because if you, follow me on social media, you might have seen this out there a few months back. I don't remember exactly the date on it, but I got an email from somebody named Daniel J. Glenn. And what Daniel wanted to know is he wanted to know if I would come on his podcast, which, I said, well, what are we talking about? He said, I want you to come on and I want to talk about Back to the Future. So this was back in September of this year. It may have been late August and it released in September. So I told Daniel absolutely, and I went on the show. And I got to be honest with you, I wasn't expecting the conversation that I got. The show, by the way, I got to give its full plug to it because Daniel J. Glenn, similar to Michael J. Fox, does a fascinating and phenomenal job on his show, Fascinating Nouns, where he talks to all kinds of people of interest to him and has these really deep conversations. And I will say, I've done a lot of podcasts talking with people about Back to the Future, especially recently. But this is one of my favorite ones because you can tell Daniel was a massive and is a massive fan of the Back to the Future trilogy, and he had really smart questions. And at times in the interview, I feel like he and I were going back and forth, and I was defending the Back to the Future franchise, even maybe some perceived flaws that it could have. And Daniel and I had fun talking about the nitpicks of Back to the Future. And I really enjoyed his conversation, so much so that when I was putting together Season 7, I reached out to Daniel and I said, hey, man, I really liked our conversation about Back to the Future a lot. I don't have these kind of conversations with a lot of people who challenge me about the franchise. So I asked him, I think it would be a really cool thing to have you, or at least have our conversation that we did on your podcast, on the Back to the Future podcast. And he was gracious enough and lovely enough to accept that request and oblige me. So this is going to be my interview on Fascinating Nouns with Daniel J. Glenn. We talk about Back to the Future. He asked me some questions you might know the answers to, but there's a lot of meat here where we discuss things that I haven't ever really even thought about, or if I did, you'll see on the fly, I'm trying to come up with reasoning. And I think on some respects, I had him. I think in some respects he may have had me, but you know what? That's why I wanted to give it to the pinheads out here in Back to the Future, the podcast. I want you to tell us, who do you think won the arguments over the nitpicks? But more than that, because that wasn't all this show was about. It was about much more. So more than that, I want you to enjoy my conversation with Daniel J. Glenn, and please subscribe to his podcast, Fascinating Nouns. But without further ado, let's jump right into my convo about the Back to the Future trilogy with Daniel J. Glenn here on Back to the Future, the podcast.
And Back to the Future, you and I kind of came to the same movies. I think we have the same passions, and I'm going to argue you may not have spoken to anyone who is as knowledgeable on Back to the Future as you are. So I'm very excited to talk about this. This is my favorite franchise of all time. I mean, I love time travel, and as I mentioned before, I've got another podcast where we've profiled a lot of the kind of the hidden gadgets in that. We haven't done Doc's mind reading machine. That's going to be next, but we've done a lot of this stuff. I was introduced to the series through the books. Do you know about the novelizations, and have you read them?
I do have the novelizations. I haven't read them. I haven't read the third one entirely, but I did read the first two. And I remember reading the first one. I got it maybe in, I don't know, when I was in middle school.
Uh-huh.
And it was what I did a book assignment on, and the cover's now torn off from reading it too much. But yeah. So you found them through the books?
Yeah. Well, I remember reading. So in my when I was a kid, there was the Back to the Future book, and it was in the library, and it had a hard piece of plastic. It was a softcover book, but it had a hard piece of plastic protecting it. And I remember it was one of those books. It was the first time I remember having that evil thought of like, I could just steal this book. I can't get it anywhere else. I'm just a kid. Maybe if I just left the library with it. You know, I remember thinking that. I never did, but I checked it out a million times. I think that is how and then I bought, when I was in elementary school, they had this thing called Troll Books. They would send out these little pieces of paper, and you would fill it out and buy the books. And that's how I bought 2 and 3. And what I loved about the novelizations, first of all, that they had novelizations of movies was really weird. It seems like a reverse trajectory of what people in Hollywood do now, which is go from novel to movie. But they also had lots of really key details that were not in the movie outright, but filled in a lot of gaps and helped me understand the storylines a little bit better.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is always interesting to see really the opposite way. Because I remember reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or the Philosopher's Stone, if you're a European listener.
Right.
And I remember reading it, and then when the movie came out, I'm like, let's go. I'm ready to see Harry Potter. And they changed like a few things, and that's the first thing that I think of. So I wonder how it was for you reading the book and then seeing the film. Did you say, oh, wait a minute, that's not how the story is, or that wasn't that's not supposed to be there?
No, it's an interesting question. I like that because what they did in the books, and I think Craig Sean Gardner is the one who wrote them, because he also wrote the Batman novelization, which I also had. I was kind of a nerd back then. But what's great about the books is because they started with the screenplay. So they were just expounding upon the screenplay itself and you know, filling in the gaps and showing in all the details. When you go from a book to a movie, you have to deal with the author and a different screenwriter and all that. And they have to change things for the movie. The movie is really like a shaved down version of a book. And the books in the Back to the Future case were just kind of like an expanded version of the movie.
Oh.
So to answer your question, I really enjoyed reading the books after seeing the movies, especially because there were little things that they mention that you don't really know. Like when Biff, like in Back to the Future 2, when Biff's running around with the almanac, they talk about his, you know, how he's thinking with the almanac and why he has it and how he doesn't really care about it. And you see that in the movie where he kind of puts it in his back pocket, puts the ooh la la cover over. But they have this kind of nice expository writing that tells you exactly what he's thinking when he gets it, has it in his pocket, and then as he gets more attached to it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. It is interesting how much more detail you can go into a textualized version of the film and really read what you end up seeing. But the novelization, now you made me want to go back and revisit them. Now
you should,
I have to. I really have them in a drawer, like in the other room. So I need to pull them out and read it. Now I'm going to look at it through those lenses.
Well, here's what I did. I wanted to kind of talk real Back to the Future stuff with you because in preparation I watched these movies back to back to back. And this was really the first time I'd done it in a long time. I've seen the movies, you know, obviously, I saw the first one a million times. I saw the second movie, this is kind of interesting, I saw the second movie at my library on a film reel. They showed it, I think, the same summer it came out. I don't really know how that worked, but I remember going to my local library, the same library that had the novelization of Back to the Future, and saw someone with a film projector and watched Back to the Future 2 for the first time.
That's crazy.
That way.
That's crazy.
I know. It's really weird. But one of the things, you know, in some of the other interviews I've heard you talk about it in the book, there's a lot of this conversation of what's the best Back to the Future movie. And I think definitively, I'm going to say this here, I think definitively Back to the Future 1 is the best movie. I think objectively you can't argue that, but I think you can argue what's your favorite movie. And I think there are several reasons for that, but I kind of want to get your take on that first.
Yeah, so I agree. First off, the first Back to the Future is a perfect movie. There's really no gripes about it. It's the best, most fulfilling, fun story out of the three. And like I said, they knocked it out of the park first try. The favorite thing is interesting because my favorite as a child was the third one. I love Back to the Future 3. And again, I don't know if that's because I'm from Texas and Western was a thing.
Yeah.
I really loved Back to the Future 3 when I was a kid. I watched that one the most. And then, and it's really to me like a, Daniel, when you talk about whether it's your Mount Rushmore of wrestlers or your top 5 dead or alive rappers, it changes all the time. You might have the same guys, but you might say, okay, now number 1 is Pac, or now number 1 is Hogan or The Rock or whomever, right? So I think that's how it is for me in Back to the Future is number 1's the best, but when I talk about my favorites, sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's 3. Recently, 2 has been getting a lot of play in my mind and a lot of love, and I think that it's now kind of looked over a little too much for how influential that film really is. Best movie to come out in 1989. I know that's controversial, but that's neither here nor there. And I just think that it's an ever fluid list though, because I find things in them all that I like more and more and more. Like I think that part 1 and part 3 are the most similar. When you look at their stories of Doc and Marty are stuck in the past with no clear way to get to the future, and they have to come up with some accidental way of figuring out how to get back there. Like we know the train's going to be there at this time. We know lightning's going to strike at this time, but we have to make sure that everything goes perfectly and smoothly. This is our only opportunity to do that. 2 doesn't really have that. I mean, it does in the sense of we have to stop, Biff and prevent this alternate 1985 or what have you. But I think 1 and 3 are the most similar in my mind. And even Marty being distracted by the relationship with his mother and Crispin Glover's character George in the first film, but really his mom was a main distractor in the first film, and then in the third film it's Claire Clayton is the main distractor for Doc.
Right. So
there's all these parallels and similarities between those 2.
Yeah, I think that's I didn't really notice that, but I love that observation because it also shows one of the great things that they do in these movies is show you how history repeats itself over and over and over again, and I love that theme. With Back to the Future 1, what I like about it is they set these rules up for time travel. They explain time travel better, and in Back to the Future 2, they explain time travel they explain time travel better than anything I've ever heard in Back to the Future 1. They explain alternate futures better than anything I've ever heard in Back to the Future 2. What bothers me about Back to the Future 2 and 3, number 1, from a tone standpoint, they're incredibly different. They're obviously influenced by Zemeckis' Roger Rabbit days, and they're very broad. The characters are much bigger, whereas Back to the Future 1 is more, the characterizations, the portrayals are much more rooted in reality. They're very relatable, and I really like that. I don't love the big stuff. Biff goes from being a bully with some homicidal tendencies when he tries to, I forgot that he tries to kill him in the skateboarding scene. I forgot that he actually does try to ram him with his car. So my argument went out the window. But in Back to the Future 2, he becomes like a homicidal maniac. I mean, he's really off the deep end. And in Back to the Future 2, they break their own time travel rules, which I really don't like. So the first time that they do it, in the beginning of the movie, they establish that you need to fill up the Mr. Fusion. You need, in the first movie, they say 1 rod, 1 trip, right? And that's why he gets stuck in 1955. When he comes blasting at the end of the first movie and they redo it in the beginning of the second movie, he fills up Mr. Fusion and he has to go back. So when they're in 2015, Biff steals the time machine without refilling it, goes back into the past. He figures out that it has to get up to 88 miles per hour, that it can fly. He figures out how to go through time, ends up in 1955, no problem, and then gets back to 2015. He makes 2 trips without refilling Mr. Fusion. And that essentially breaks their rules of having to fill up Mr. Fusion. And I know it's a movie, and I get that. But what made the first movie so good is that those attention to those little details that made it so great. Second one, really quickly, is at the end of that movie, he gets struck by lightning and goes through time without having to hit 88 miles per hour. So that's 2 major diversions from their own rules.
I hear you, and I understand, and I think that you make great points, and they're all valid. However, the science behind Mr. Fusion, I don't think was ever explicitly described within the context of the film. We did know with the plutonium chamber, 1 trip, that's it, right? With Mr. Fusion, I was always led to believe the reason he replaced the plutonium chamber was for that very purpose. He learned from his mistakes like every good inventor would do, and he said, you know what? That 1 trip, 1 thing, that doesn't really work out really well because Marty got stuck in the past. He finds Mr. Fusion, and that allows him, I guess we're led to believe at least, and we can make the assumption that that allows him to make multiple trips without having to refuel it. I do grant you that the Biff part of it in Back to the Future 2, we're giving them a little, the fact that he happens to know how to operate it. I would say that the 1955 date, it could have been coincidental in the fact that the time circuits were having some issues, and they could have already just been on that because that was their most recent trip, in the first movie. But that is a little strange, and he gets up to 88 miles an hour. I'm thinking maybe old man Biff, when he broke his cane, the cane was forced on the accelerator and then just shot him to 90 miles per hour, and he didn't realize how he did it. And then he thought, well, let me just recreate what I did. That is giving the movie a lot.
A lot of reaches there, Brad.
There were a few. Yeah. There were a few. And then the second part was, you said,
getting struck by lightning.
Oh, the struck by lightning. Yeah. Again, I just chalked that up to the flux capacitor and the time circuits were having problems and some issues that circumvented the need to go 88 miles per hour. And the lightning was thus that it was over 1.21 gigawatts, and it just sent him right back to 1885. I do realize that those are some nitpicks that you can do.
Nitpicks? Those are huge. Those are gigantic.
I think those are nitpicks. But see, those are gigantic for somebody who thinks like you with the technology podcast. Y'all are looking at this. Those are things that I think that the layman doesn't. But I do agree in the first one, even if you're trying to pick nits, you're not going to find them. So that is a difference. I do agree. However, they're great movies.
No, they are great movies. I mean, that's spoken like a true Back to the Future loyalist for sure. I mean, I do have to take issue with the nitpicking with the 88 miles per hour. That is the thing everyone remembers. You can say whatever you want about the Biff going back, and I'll give you that for argument's sake. But just standing in one spot and then getting struck by lightning and going back into time, the 88 miles per hour was key to activating the time circuits. So,
well, let me ask you this then.
Yeah.
With the hover conversion, I'm assuming the engine has to be running for it to be flying in the air. And I would imagine that would take a lot more RPM to jack up a DeLorean in a hovering above a street.
Yeah.
How do we know that he wasn't, even though he was stationary, the engine wasn't at 88 miles per hour, just based on the RPMs needed to get it up to hover?
I mean, it's an interesting thought. I mean, what this is really, the fundamental point I'm saying is what I like about the first movie is everything's explained and they follow their rules. And in this one, you have to make a lot of leaps. And I think that makes it less of a solid movie. Is it enjoyable? Yeah, of course. I mean, I love watching these movies. And one of the other things, as I was watching these, I really was going with a whole different frame of mind and kind of having a conversation that I don't know if anyone else has ever had before. But when I watched these movies, when I was finished watching them, I realized a couple of things. We don't really know a lot about the protagonists of this movie. We don't really know that much about Marty's life, except that he has Jennifer. We know his family, obviously. That's it. We don't really know his friends. We know he plays rock and roll. We don't know a lot about his school. We don't know anything. Doc, we know nothing about we know he had money and then lost it somehow. We don't know what he's a doctor of. He says he's a student of all the sciences. I don't even know what that means. We don't really know why he's hanging out with a high schooler. And this is one of those movies that got away with this in the 80s, like Meatballs, where you have like a much older person hanging out with a high schooler. This would not fly today, in today's world. These were just some of the things that just struck me when I watched them that like, man, we don't even really know Marty and Doc at all.
Yeah, and I've heard that over the years. Now, they've done their best in subsequent releases, whether it be comic books or whatever, to try to fill in some of that continuity. There is I think it's a video on YouTube is from Script to Screen or something like that. I think it's the series. And they do one on Back to the Future. And at the end of the movie, you actually see Marty. There's a package from Marty in the McFly house where he was receiving his demo tape back from the record company that he's in, kind of fulfilling that prophecy, if you will. Because I actually think people say that Marty doesn't grow or doesn't learn anything. There's no character arc for him in Back to the Future 1. I actually disagree with that. I think that Marty learns by proxy of George that you can't fear rejection and you need to stand up for yourself and do what you truly believe is right and what you want. And that's what that package at the end of the movie really, I think, symbolizes. But we don't know a whole lot on the onset. In the comic books, they did explain the relationship between Marty and Doc, and it was something as simple as Doc had an amplifier and Marty played a guitar, and he needed a part for his amp, and the guy was like, oh, I sold it to this doctor down the street, and then he goes and meets him, and they become friends or what have you. I don't particularly I'm not in love with that explanation, but I'll accept it.
Yeah.
I'll accept it.
Yeah.
I'm not in love with it, but I accept it. But yeah, I think that the backstory really that you needed to know is, I think that Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis were telling you everything that you needed to know about Marty by telling you about his family, by telling you about Lorraine and George. George being this pushover dad who's been bullied by the same guy for 30 years. His mother, what could have been, but now she's an alcoholic because his uncle's in prison. And there's all these family dynamics that I think shape whom he is. And to me, that explains his love of rock and roll. It's his escapism. His music's his escapism from his current reality. And that's why, if you realize, his goal really in the movie is to get his girlfriend to a lake and sleep in the back of a truck with some sleeping bags. Because, again, he's trying to escape his current position, his current family situation. It's always about escapism. That's why I think that his fascination with Doc and their friendship is even more evident, because they're trying to, again, escape. Marty wants to use this doctor who has all these wild ideas and these inventions, and he's got this big amplifier, and they hang out and they talk to escape his current family situation. So I think that although it's not explicitly stated in the film, it's in the subtext if you just kind of put your mind to it and accomplish anything. I think.
No, I think that's right. I just thought it was I mean, I think all of that's a very accurate assessment. It's just weird when you watch the movies and you realize that, like, yeah, I love their friendship. They're cool. I love watching them. But man, we don't 100%. Know anything about them. Like, it's 100%. It's a little strange. It's funny, but what else is great about this movie is when we talk about great movies are really hard to do. I work in entertainment, and I've seen, whatever the creative project is, going from script to screen, and then sometimes back to book. But going from script to screen is very difficult. And this, what I loved is, I'm going to go through just some of the trials and tribulations that it even took to get this movie on screen, and how many different pitfalls along the way that they managed to jump over, Indiana Jones style, to even have the movie be a success. So Robert Zemeckis, really quickly, here's a tidbit for people. So my undergrad school is NIU, Northern Illinois University. Robert Zemeckis went there for a semester because he's from the Chicago area, I believe. And so one of my professors really latched onto that and taught a whole film series on Zemeckis films. So I think I'm one of the few people in the country who's actually taken collegiate level classes on all of Zemeckis' films. Yeah, but there's.
I wish they would have offered that to me.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun, but you do see the transition right around this movie, Roger Rabbit in this movie, and then into Forrest Gump, how he just goes from, early on a little more realistic films into a much more bigger, broader, into what his style is really known for. But so they wrote this movie. Great origin story. Bob Gale saw a yearbook, I believe his dad's yearbook, and realized he and his dad wouldn't be friends, and that's kind of how the genesis of the idea came in. But if you don't mind, just walk me through how they went from that idea and then even getting the green light to get the movie made.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right on the head. Bob Gale was visiting his parents back home, and he was going through his dad's closet or attic, finds a yearbook, says, I didn't know my dad was a class president. That's crazy. I would have nothing to do with the class president of my graduating class. I wonder if my dad and I would have been friends in high school. Boom, there's the germ of the idea. He and Robert Zemeckis have been writing a lot. We talked a little bit off the air about Bordello of Blood or the Kolchak the Night Stalker series. They have been working on stuff together, and they really loved the idea of doing a time travel movie, but just didn't really know how to do it. When Bob had this idea, he said, this is the mechanism we can use to write this time travel story. And they wrote it. Columbia Pictures liked it. A guy named Frank Price over there really enjoyed it. He commissioned them to write the script. They wrote it. It didn't really turn out the way that they thought. There was kind of some up and down production stuff. And then they just continued to pitch it, the movie to different studios. And everyone was like, it's good. It's a fun family story, but we're in Fast Times in Ridgemont High right now. That's the kind of film we want. We want a little Animal House. We want something a little bit more edgy, a little more R-rated teen comedy.
Porky's was out that time too, not to bring up
yeah, there you go.
Classic.
So he was like, everyone told them, you should take this movie to Disney. Disney would love this movie. So they said, okay, yeah, we'll go to Disney. So they took it to Disney, and Disney was like, are you out of your mind? We would never make this movie. This is an incestual relationship between a son and mom.
Right.
There's no way we're putting this in the House of Mouse. So again, they felt defeated. So finally, Robert Zemeckis is like, okay, look, I really would love to make this movie, Bob, but obviously it's not working out. I got to do something. Because they didn't have any real big successes, even with Steven Spielberg. I mean, they wrote 1941. It was kind of Spielberg's first movie that was panned by critics and really the box office. So he said, Robert Zemeckis said, I got to just do the next movie that comes across. It's a decent script that I can try to make something successful. That was Romancing the Stone, which is a great movie. Kathleen Turner, Michael Douglas, Danny DeVito. Real fun action adventure, kind of Indiana Jones vibe-ish to it. And it was a huge success. And then once he had that success, Universal was like, hey, what do you want to make next? And he's like, I got this movie, Back to the Future. And they're like, oh, we'd love to. And they said, well, we only want one guy to produce it. That's Steven Spielberg. Zemeckis and Spielberg and Gale, they were all friends with each other. They had worked together in a couple prior movies, and they resisted working with Spielberg initially when they wrote the script and were shopping it, because they said, I don't want to be the guy, or the guys who only get their movies made because Steven Spielberg is their buddy and he's just throwing them a bone. So then they went back to him, and then they finally got the green light, finally, to make Back to the Future. They had to get the script over from Columbia, the rights, and they figured it all out. They got it, and green light was go. They had a mandate, though, where they had to make the movie by a certain time or the movie wouldn't be released. And then, chaos ensues.
Right. Well, let's talk about a couple highlights there without getting bogged down in too much of the weeds, but there's some really fun stuff here. So they wanted Michael J. Fox. He was their number one guy. He was tied up with family ties. Gary Goldberg in this little part of the story is kind of the villain for a little bit, because he doesn't want Michael J. Fox to do that, which I don't. Man, I feel like there would have been a bigger fight, because when you're talking about a TV star getting into a big blockbuster movie, I feel like agents and lawyers would get involved and it would have made that happen. It wouldn't have been like handshake deals and phone calls, but I don't know. But that was a really interesting part. So Michael J. Fox was out. They hired Eric Stoltz, who filmed for 5 weeks, and the only reason they didn't use him is because he just wasn't hitting the comedy, right? I mean, this is kind of the reason for that. And then for Doc Brown, they had Jeff Goldblum, Michael Keaton, John Cleese, Gene Wilder, Chevy Chase, Eddie Murphy. Is this true?
Eddie
Is
Murphy.
that right?
Yeah. All those guys you just listed were on the call sheet. I don't know where it is. I have a book that has the entire call sheet for both characters.
Wow, that's cool.
All the people they called, like Johnny Depp was one for Marty McFly. There's a lot of guys. C. Thomas Howell, I think, was another one. But with Doc, Jeff Goldblum, you could see, right?
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense. He would have been a little young back then. It still makes sense. Gene Wilder, I could have seen. Eddie Murphy was a real stretch for Doc Brown.
It would have been a really weird movie, but that's one of those weird choices because Christopher Lloyd wasn't a traditional choice. But if you went with Eddie Murphy, it would have been a totally different movie, but that would have been a very interesting take, I think, of all of them.
So I have a Back to the Future podcast where we talk about stuff like this all the time, and I did a show with my friend Kevin Smets where we recasted Back to the Future for 2020. And who would be good options, who would be good choices. And we both thought that Eddie Murphy now would be a phenomenal Doc Brown.
Wow, that's
now in this stage in life, Eddie Murphy revisiting and being Doc Brown, we think would be awesome. I think that you're right, though. They went to Gary Goldberg, and I don't even think that it reached Michael J. Fox's ears at the time. I think it was, hey, we're thinking about Michael. Would he be available? And I think one of the co-stars was out, whether it was a pregnancy or something to that extent. So Gary was like, no. I need Michael right now. We're the number one show on television. I can't lose my star, Alex P. Keaton. No dice. So they do go with Eric Stoltz. And, as everything does, it's somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks. Everyone has their different – someone says 6, some say 7, some say 5. But they filmed for him for almost 2 months, right, let's just say, nearly. And they had almost completed the entire movie. I talked to Don Fullilove, who plays Mayor Goldie Wilson, and he said, I was done. I was already back home, off the set, wasn't thinking about it. Christopher Lloyd said, I thought I was almost finished. Biff was done with his scene. Everyone was pretty much wrapping up, and they got to the point of production where they started talking to each other like, hey, what do you got lined up next? oh, cool. Is there a part for that in me? You think you could talk to your? They started getting to that small talk that you get on the set when you're close to wrapping. And Steven Spielberg sat down with Zemeckis and Gale, and they watched the dailies. And you're right, Stoltz just wasn't hitting the comedy. He was playing it like an actual person would. Mm-hmm. If either one of us, Daniel, if we were sent back to the past and our mom had the hots for us, and we were trying to figure out how to prevent being erased from existence, we'd probably be freaking out a little bit more.
Right.
We'd probably take this a little bit more seriously. Even though Michael J. Fox was a great reactionary character comedically, I think that Eric Stoltz was thinking about this fourth dimensionally, and he was thinking about it, as if it were real. And he was a method actor as well, so he was in character the whole time. I think that probably rubbed a few people the wrong way. So they make the decision to fire him, and then they go back to see if Michael J. Fox was available. Gary Goldberg says, "Okay, Michael can do it, so long as he knows Family Ties always comes first. You have to film Family Ties. He can do this nights, weekends, whenever after Family Ties." So they said, sure. Michael J. Fox comes in. He says, "I want you to read this script, but know that Family Ties comes first, so you're going to have to work 24/7 if you want it. You take it home, read it." Michael J. Fox grabs the envelope and throws it back on Gary Goldberg's desk and says, "It's the best script I've ever read. Can't wait to do it." Mm-hmm. So Michael J. Fox accepts the role as Marty McFly without ever reading the script. And just because he's like, Steven Spielberg? Yeah, sounds great. Right. And then he became the perfect Marty McFly.
Yeah, well, and it's so that happens, but that triggers a lot of events, especially with Claudia Wells. Claudia Wells had an interesting thing because she was cast for it, then she gets a sitcom, so she cancels, and they get Melora Hardin, who's amazing, but she's super tall, and so when they get Michael J. Fox back in, the height's too different. Then Claudia Wells is done with her sitcom, so then she comes back to the show, and then Christopher Lloyd almost didn't even read the script. His wife encouraged him, so he almost wasn't even in it. I mean, all of these near misses. This is the kind of stuff that people don't. This is the stuff that's exciting to me because all of these things, if anything had gone wrong, we wouldn't have this particular movie. I mean, and even this is the weirdest thing in your book, I think, or the weirdest little factoid, is that Sid Sheinberg almost called it the spaceman from Pluto. He sent a legitimate suggestion, and Steven Spielberg, handled it amazingly, played it off as a joke, but he really wanted to did he really want to name it Spaceman from Pluto? Is that that's true? Yeah,
he did. So in the movie, if you remember, they end up when Marty first goes back to 1955, he's on Old Man Peabody's Twin Pines Ranch, and he crashes into the barn. And when his son Sherman comes out and says, it's an alien, he already mutated into human form. And you look at the comic book, it's called Space Zombies from Pluto is the name of the comic book. Yeah. So when Sid Sheinberg was giving suggestions, which by the way, we always talk about the Spaceman from Pluto one because it is ridiculous and it's a terrible idea. But he did come up with some good ideas for the movie. Like he's one who named Lorraine. The name was something prior. He chose Lorraine. It wasn't the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. It was the Springtime in Paris dance. It wasn't Doc Brown. It was Professor Brown. Einstein wasn't a dog. It was a chimp. He made all these changes, which all worked out. And then he was like Spaceman from Pluto. That's the title. Right. That's because he's like Back to the Future. Yeah. That doesn't make any sense. How can you go back to the future? Makes no sense. Spaceman from Pluto. And then Steven Spielberg essentially, made him think that they thought it was a joke, and he wrote it. "Hey, thanks for the big laugh. We really appreciate it. Oh man, we needed that on set." And just kind of ignored it. He never heard back from Sid Sheinberg, so he was like, "Okay, cool. We were able to do it."
Well, I love that they think it doesn't make.
But subsequently, let me say this real quick, Daniel. There was a movie that came out, I think in 2018, maybe. It was called A House with a Clock in Its Walls.
Okay.
Jack Black was the star of it, and there's a scene where they're pulling up on a bus, and there's an old marquee for a movie theater on this street, and the name of the movie playing on the marquee is Spaceman from Pluto.
Oh, that's great.
It was a little Easter egg for Back to the Future.
Do you know whose idea that was to put that in?
I don't know. I think Eli Roth had some involvement with the movie. I believe.
Is he a known Back to the Future fan? Is that?
I'm
so
assuming.
Inside.
I actually was on. Speaking of wrestling, I was on Chris Jericho's podcast, and he was the one who told me that Eli Roth probably had something to do with it.
Interesting. Okay.
I haven't looked into it much than that, but I did see it on the marquee and was like, oh, I know what that is.
That's funny. Wow. You know, one of the tragedies of this series, I think, and to be perfectly honest with you, I think maybe I'm wrong with this, but I think the fact that Crispin Glover was not involved with the sequels was such a detriment to the movie for a couple of reasons. Number one, to me, the first movie is about Crispin Glover, obviously. The second movie is really about Biff. The third movie is about Doc. And he is so, when I rewatch, he's so good. He is so good in that movie. Now, I know his roles would have been limited in the other movies, but what it forced them to do for comic effect, I'm assuming, is it made them put Marty and Leah Thompson as basically they played all of their ancestors, which got a little tired after a while. And if they were able to like mix in Crispin Glover in there or in some way, even if Crispin Glover was like the kid, I don't know how you do it. I'm bad pitches here, but I feel like just getting him into the mix would have made that a little bit more interesting. I don't know.
Oh, absolutely. What I loved about Crispin Glover's portrayal, and when I got to talk to him late last year, it was the one thing that I brought up to him was his ability, his physical presence on the screen was what made, to me, George McFly so interesting. The way that he had these beautiful movements when he was doing his line readings and delivery just made that character. But and I try not to get into it in the book because I'm just not I'm not a person who's really interested in drama too much, or I'm interested in hearing about it. I'm not interested in perpetuating it. So I didn't really get into the rift between him and Bob Gale, which seems to continue to go to this day. You know, he and Zemeckis patched things up. They did Beowulf together. And so, you know, that hatchet, if there was one, was buried. But, you know, you hear Bob Gale says he wanted too much money. Crispin Glover said, well, it was something different. And, you know, he didn't end up being in the second film. I think that his role would have been larger in the second and third films than what we saw George McFly in, because they would have had Crispin. Mm-hmm. And when they found out they weren't getting Crispin, when they were making the sequels, that's when they decided, well, hey, we're writers. Let's just write out George McFly. He's dead. Now he's dead in 1985. And that was the reason. The whole reason we had the George is dead in the alternate 1985 was because we didn't have Crispin Glover. So I think that his role would have been bigger. It would have been funny to see him as an Irishman in the Old West. I think that he probably would have killed that. He probably would have been fantastic as an Irishman in the Old West. But he was really a true gem in that first movie. And I think that his career is really based upon that performance. I think that everybody, when you have him, think about any movie you've seen Crispin Glover in subsequently, it's always some sort of an evolution of George McFly. Even in playing the creepy man in the Charlie's Angels films, it was really like a grown up odd George McFly. So maybe that's just who Crispin is. I don't know. I've only talked to him once, but I think that the films, did they suffer for him not being in it? You could make that argument by saying they would have been better with him in it. However, I think that they handled it really well, and the actor who was brought in to play George McFly in parts 2 and 3, Jeffrey Weissman, who I've gotten to know really well over the years. You talk about somebody who had to take a gigantic task of taking over this role of George McFly, even it being a smaller role in the second and third films. You have to take this iconic role from Back to the Future and step into those shoes of one of the greatest portrayals of a character on screen. I have a lot of respect for what Jeffrey Weissman was able to pull off, but it's the reason, Daniel, that they did the in Back to the Future 2 when we see George as an old man in 2015 and he's on the ortho-lev and he's upside down being dragged through the house. They did that to disorient you in any possible way from not knowing that was not Crispin Glover.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say that his voice sounds like a caricature of George McFly. It's not as nuanced as George was. And I listened to your interview with Crispin Glover, and I loved the question that you gave him because his answer is, I mean, it's such an actor's answer, but I love the idea of him getting into the mindset and then that turned itself into physical manifestations of that. Because you're right. And it's not even so much I mean, he moves in a very specific way, but just I've never seen anyone point and then look at what you're pointing at. There's a scene in the cafeteria where he points to Biff hitting on Lorraine. I mean, really, he's harassing her, sexually harassing her. Let's be honest.
Sure.
But he points and then he looks up. And then when they're in the diner, he's talking to Biff, and he's turned around from the counter, and then he grabs a thing of cereal and then puts the cereal up. You know, I've never seen anyone eat cereal that wasn't over a bowl. You know, I mean, it's just these weird little things that he did that just made him so particular that no one's ever done. And I really enjoyed hearing him give that answer. That was great.
Wasn't it weird though in Back to the Future 1 when he goes into the diner for the second time before he's about to tell Lorraine, "You're my density"? I don't know where this irrational confidence of him saying, "Give me a milk chocolate," and then he slides it down and he grabs it and chugs it, slams it down. It did seem a little bit out of base for George McFly, but I've always enjoyed "Give me a milk chocolate." When I was actually writing, when people were buying books and they were like asking me to inscribe them, I don't know what to put inside a book cover, so I would just said the same thing to about 100 people, like, "Drink this with a glass of milk." Chocolate. And I didn't know what to say, so that was my joke.
I love that. I love that scene. That particular moment. It didn't strike me as irrational until you mentioned it, but it totally is. It doesn't make any sense, and that is so. I laugh out loud every time I see it. My high school girlfriend. I remember this. I remember us watching that, and when he gets the milk, and then he turns around and walks to Lorraine with his little notebook open. There's a guy sitting in a booth, and he says, "Cherry Coke." I don't know if you know that, yeah? So my girlfriend at the time, I remember her saying to me, that guy is loving life because he got to say a line in Back to the Future. He's just an extra who showed up for the day, who happened to get picked up on the mic, you know? And it's like, now he's in cinematic history, you know? I mean, it's kind of this cool moment. So you mentioned the podcast. So you started this podcast just to ring in Future Day, is that right?
So somewhat, yeah. It was 2015. I was listening to this podcast at the time called Signcast, and it was a podcast about Seinfeld. And I love Seinfeld. I'm a massive Seinfeld fan. You've seen all the episodes a million times. I actually talked to the Soup Nazi yesterday, which is really cool. But I was listening to the podcast and was like, man, I wonder if there's a Back to the Future podcast out there, because of course there's 100 million wrestling podcasts. There was the Seinfeld podcast. I was like, I wonder if there's something about Back to the Future, because there's movies that I've always watched. And I went to the Apple store, did search on Back to the Future. I found like a couple of shows that had talked about the movie, but they talk about all kinds of movies. There was no centrally focused Back to the Future, this is all we're discussing every episode podcast. And I was like, God, man, I wish there was one. Then I was like, wait a minute. I'm in radio. I do a podcast. What if I did the Back to the Future podcast? So I started it, and I was really just going to be like a short mini series leading up to Future Day. I was like, I'll talk to all these people, as many people as I can get, talk about like these interesting things that I've always thought about the movie, and then, you know, Future Day will come and go, and it'll be the end of it. So I started reaching out to people, and then a lot of people were really receptive to it. Jeffrey Weissman, who I talked about earlier, who played George McFly in 2 and 3, he was down to do the podcast. Claudia Wells was. Kevin Pike, who was the special effects supervisor on Back to the Future 1, and he did Jurassic Park and Jaws, all these great movies. So he came on the podcast. He was really gracious with his time. And next thing I knew, I just had all these interesting interviews with all these cool people leading up to Future Day. And I said, you know, might as well keep going. So I made it a serialized podcast where there's, you know, seasons of it. And we just wrapped up the 6th season of Back to the Future, the podcast, where in that batch of shows, I talked to Leah Thompson and Crispin Glover and Don Full of Love and all kinds of people. So it's been really cool to get to know people through the podcast and to have these conversations like you and I are having, Daniel. And the podcast is really what led to the book. Without the podcast, I had a friend named Ken Knapsack who wrote a book called Why We Love Star Wars for Mango Publishing. And so I got into conversations with him and the publishing house, and they're like, well, you know, we would love to have you. And they almost signed me to a publishing deal without any ideas. And they were like, what would you like? They literally said, what would you like to write a book about? And so I was like, oh, you know, I love wrestling. I'd like to write a book about wrestling maybe. And they're like, well, send in a couple pitches. And I had this idea about a Back to the Future book, and I sent that into them. And they're like, we want to publish this one now, ASAP. You know, 35th anniversary is coming up. Let's get to work on it. And I really did my best to make the book an extension of the podcast. And the podcast is just it's a celebration. I love the movies. I'm an eternal optimist. I only see the good in everything. So I just want to talk about how much I love these movies with people who love them equally. And it's been really cool to talk to so many people from the films and have them on the podcast in one way or another. Now, some of them are like promo radio interviews that I do for my radio show, which is what the Leah Thompson and Crispin Glover ones were. But even the ability to have them on and ask them even a little bit about Back to the Future, it's just been incredible for me. So that was really the genesis of the idea of the podcast.
Okay. I got to tell you, I love the way you kind of worked that in with it, because I knew your interview with Crispin was a promo interview, and it was, I got to tell you, it was pretty artful the way you were able to sneak in a couple of Back to the Future questions without, pushing the limit a little bit there.
Right.
Crispin Glover is an absolute shame. I don't know if the movies would have been better or worse, but it's just a shame they didn't get him. Elizabeth Shue, I love Elizabeth Shue, and I think it was great casting. It's difficult because when you see this takes everything out. It always takes me out of the reality when you see a new actor replaced. And when Elizabeth Shue replaced Claudia Wells, especially because she has such a big part in the second movie, it was very disappointing. But I mean, what was the? Can you talk just really quickly? What was the reason? And have you gotten Elizabeth Shue on your show, or is she a target next?
She's definitely a target. I haven't been able to talk to her, but I've gotten to know Claudia Wells pretty well, to where we'll exchange text here and there. And the reason was Claudia did the first movie. They wanted her back for the second one, but her mother was battling an illness, and she chose to take care of family rather than continue to pursue her Hollywood career. And she has from all my conversations with her, she has no regrets or qualms about not reprising her role in the sequels. And they moved on, and they got Elizabeth Shue, who's a quality actress, obviously still working today and still as relevant as ever. But I didn't notice it when I was a kid.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I did not notice it at
true.
all. I did not know that they changed the girlfriend out ever. It wasn't until I got older I was like, wait a minute, that's not the same person. Yeah. And by the way, Claudia Wells in 1985, I mean, drop dead, gorgeous, all-time Mount Rushmore beauty. And she was great in the film. I would have loved to see her in 2 and 3. But yeah, that was the reason. She had to take care of family.
Wow. Yeah, that's unfortunate, because it would have been great to see her, because the role's expanded quite a bit, and it would have been nice to actually see her get some screen time. Because I mean, she's just so charming and so likable, and you just rooting for him, and you want to see her have her own little storyline, especially see herself in the future and all that. It's just it's great stuff. So the last thing I want to ask you, this I thought was really cool, and this is a moment from the book where you talk about your least favorite cut. I guess how I want to put this. You talk about different cuts in the movie, and this is the one that you think should have actually been in the movie. I agree with you 100%. I think you make a great argument here. Can you talk about that really quickly, and why you liked it and what it is?
Yeah. So what was weird to me as somebody who watched these movies over and over and over again, in Back to the Future 2, we talked about Biff stealing the time machine and coming back, old man Biff. And when he comes back, he's like all haggard, and he's like hurting, and he's slunched over, and he can barely walk. He looks like he's sweating, and I never really got that.
I agree.
I never
too.
understood what that was. Yeah. It didn't ever connect with me. And then when I was looking at we did a series of shows on the podcast about, it was good cut, bad cut. Was this a good idea to cut it out of the movie? Was it a bad idea? And one of them was Biff, the old man Biff scene. So in the extended version of that scene, you see Marty and Doc, come back, and they're like, "Oh, what happened? Let's get out of here, Marty." And they're starting to take the time machine, and Biff is hiding behind a car, old man Biff, and he's slunched over, and he's like kind of shaking and sweating again. His hair's all haggard, and then he slowly disappears. And when I saw that, I was like, "Oh, that is a great scene." Mm-hmm. It's telling you that old man Biff did something in the past that has now altered his future, the same way that happened to Marty in the first film. Marty prevents his mom and dad from meeting, and then his brother and his sister disappear, and they get erased from existence. Yeah. Right? And Marty starts to go at the enchantment of the sea dance. You see his hand. So that was what happened with old man Biff. We saw that. So when they cut it out, and you just see him kind of haggard and hunched over and sweating, you don't really understand. But had that scene been left in the movie, we would still know, wow, these actions that Biff took to enrich himself eventually still don't pay off. Even if you are the richest man in the world, you disappear. So I tried to figure out what exactly happened to Biff. Like, okay, he disappears because he made some grave mistake, but what was it? And there was actually, on the Back to the Future website, there was a Q&A with Bob Gale, where he was answering a lot of questions that Back to the Future fans have all the time, frequently asked questions. And it was on their facts page. And one of them was, why does Biff, disappear in a cutscene of Back to the Future 2? And he said, well, he and Lorraine end up getting married in the 90s, and she ends up shooting him and killing him. So then that's why he disappeared. Right. So that was the reason. But I think that if you left it in the movie, it was really a lot more meat on the bone. And it was just another 15 seconds. It was like 15 seconds or less. And I still don't know if I ever get to talk to Bob Gale or Zemeckis in an interview. Might be the first question I ask him is, why was that cut out? Because I think it could have been so important for the story of the movie and as a viewer understanding what we just saw.
I mean, I completely agree. I had all the same questions you did, and I love that explanation because it's the 15 seconds that adds so much to the movie. You could have cut out 15 seconds of Michael J. Fox playing his daughter and his son. You could have cut out 15 seconds of that silly stuff and put that into the movie, and I think it would have been a much better movie for it. One last thing I got to tell you here before I go, because Back to the Future has one mistake, and it has to do with disappearing from time, and that is after George punches Biff, they go back into the dance. And so the next thing they do is they have to kiss on the dance floor. So then Marty has to go and play. And so he starts playing guitar. From that moment, the moment he chooses to play guitar, and he looks at the picture. Now that changes history, because him going and him changing George is he has actively changed his own future, so he must actively change it back. When he goes on stage, he's done everything he can do. So the events that precede that are already going to happen. But we see his hand change, and then he falls down and says, "George," as this other bully is like cut in, right? And then George pushes him down. Well, Marty had nothing to do with that. Marty didn't, it's not like he heard him say, "George, kiss Lorraine," and he did not actually affect George's actions to push the bully to kiss Lorraine. So all of that would have happened just by him stepping on stage with the guitar. I know I'm nerding out here a little bit, but I think that there's a legitimate point that is almost completely extraneous. It does give us a couple of fun moments where he like jumps up and starts playing, but it's kind of extraneous. But that's the playing with the disappearing from time thing.
That is interesting, and to be honest with you, I've never thought of that. And thinking of it right now, I totally see your point. It should have happened anyway. I don't think that. I wonder if Calvin Klein's shout for George.
Here you go. Gilmore's doing the loyalist stuff.
I think that maybe George heard him and it was like, that's right. Stand up for yourself, George. And then he shoves the bully down. That is a nitpick. It is funny though. Most people bring up.
Why is every good point that I make a nitpick? These are huge, sweeping notices. These are.
But the thing most people bring up is, wouldn't his parents know who Calvin Klein is when Marty grows up? They're like, wait a minute, why don't you look just like Calvin Klein? That's like the one that everyone brings up.
That's a nitpick,
and I never thought that was.
That's a nitpick. Nothing. Daniel. Every time you've said that word, that has not really been the case, but that is a nitpick for sure. Now, if we haven't covered everything, you can get in touch with us. How do people find you on social? I imagine you're on social media. Obviously, you got this great book, which is Back from the Future, a celebration of time, the greatest time travel story ever told. Nailed it.
Yes.
How can people find the book and find you?
The book's everywhere that you normally get books: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, all those great places you can find the book. And if you want to get it directly from me, you can hit me up on Twitter at Brad Gilmore, on Facebook, Instagram. I'm very easy to find. I'm the same all over the place, and I'll be happy to get you an inscribed copy. I need to send one your way, Daniel, as well. But
please.
You can find me there. You can also check out my other shows. We talked a little wrestling. I have a show called The Hall of Fame with Booker T. We do it twice a week, talking about all things in combat sports. And there's a YouTube channel called The Reality of Wrestling, which we just passed 360,000 subscribers, which I'm really happy about. We were at 18,000 just 18 months ago. So we've made some pretty good jumps in the YouTube sphere. So check us out over there. And that's also where I house some celebrity interviews that I do. as well. So just check me out. You'll find me. Little Google search. You found 2011, so I mean, just do a Google search and you'll find some. Good stuff.
Some deep dives. I do some deep dives of Fillmore. So now, when you just for the audience, really quickly, when they order from you directly, will they get that? Give me a milk chocolate. Will you give that to everyone? Is that
if that's what they want, I will give it to them. You know, I try to mix it up, but I think that's what I should probably write from now on, because if you're a true fan, that's the reason you're buying the book. You'll appreciate the reference.
No, I love it. Brad, I cannot tell you how much fun I've had. I've got a lot of notes. I've got tons of Back to the Future stuff. I may engage you in conversation on Twitter about some of this stuff, nitpicking or not. I think you're going to like some of these ideas because I really had a whole new view of this movie.
So there it was. My conversation with Daniel J. Glenn of the Fascinating Nouns podcast. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed being on his show. And again, I am so thankful and gracious to Daniel for allowing us to air that here on Back to the Future, the podcast. Go check out his podcast, Fascinating Nouns. It's available on Apple Podcasts. That's where I listen to it every time he drops a new show. Come back next week here on Back to the Future, the podcast for a very special episode that I am excited to share with you all. Almost can't believe I got this one done. But we'll play that next week. Until then, I'm your friend in time, Brad Gilmore, and I will see you in the future.
Oh, Brad, what have you done now? Oh, Brad, what have you done now?